Hey folks, David Stewart here. Let's talk a little bit about bias today. I'd like to talk about three important things involving bias. Number one, what is bias and why is it important to know about? Number two, where does bias come from? And number three, is bias necessarily bad? And the reason I want to talk about bias is because of a lot of my experiences over the last 2 years. I made a very long video series called non-arguments, where I went through all these sophist devices I see every day on YouTube and on Twitter and other social media that's sort of lobbed my way. And I also see like politicians using them a lot. These are all the little tricks of rhetoric and language that people use in lieu of an argument to try to convince someone of their point. And I think it's very important to arm yourself against sophistry so that you are not affected by it and so that you can call out other people when they do it. However, I think bias is just as important, if not more important, because bias occurs before any kind of debate happens. And bias affects profoundly because bias affects your perception. I'm talking mostly about cognitive bias. There is active bias, like choosing what to put on the news, but I'm talking about cognitive bias. Your cognitive bias will determine your perception of reality, which in turn informs what you want to do or what you want to say online. When somebody comes in and they call me a poopy head, now my interest is I wonder what makes them call me a poopy head and how they're feeling to say that, rather than, oh yeah, you're being a sophist. Yeah, of course they're being a sophist, but what bias was changing what they perceived that I was talking about that was different from another person's, and how did that in turn, change their speech? Our cognitive biases do lots of different things. I mentioned they change your perception of reality. You can see this with witnesses. The witnesses will see two different things happen at the same time because they're looking for different things. Looking for one particular thing is a kind of bias, a searching bias. People have different reactions to the same movie. They're like, Force Awakens is awesome. Force Awakens sucks. Has to do with expectations going into it. That's a type of bias. Two different people can essentially have a different perception of what cheap is with a car. They're like, that car's cheap, that car's expensive. Well, they have a price that is anchored in their mind. They're experiencing anchoring bias, or I'm not going to buy that game unless it's $15.99. They're anchoring a perceived value of their game. That's a different kind of bias. And these are really important to know about because they affect each person individually, like they may affect you and they do affect me. So knowing about biases will help you to avoid bad consequences from biases, arming yourself against biases, the way you'd arm yourself against sophistry. But I think it's also important to see in other people so that you know kind of what they're thinking, where they're coming from. And so you can say, I think maybe your perception's kind of off with this, or I want to know how your expectations were affecting your enjoyment of that particular movie or that particular game. All that stuff to me is really interesting, and I think in a lot of ways more important because that determines the nature of the debate that happens and what happens before the debate. I still believe most people use sophist devices probably just repeating what they've seen other people do. They've seen other people insult, so they insult and think that that's a good way to sort of shut down some speech you don't like. And it works a lot of times. That's probably why they do it. However, the deeper reason of how they perceive that speech to be negative and want to do that, I think is just as fruitful sort of a journey and endeavor and search to try to figure out. And what I might want to do in the future is identify a lot of these biases that I talk about and figure out some of the ways that they may affect you and that you can possibly see them in other people. So I do think it's very important. Some of the experiences that have kind of informed me over the last 2 years, a big one is I have these videos that keep popping up with comments like months or even years after the video's been made, because the topic or the content of the video or just the title of the video in some cases is so provocative to certain people's biases, they can't help but comment. One of those was, does today's music suck? And I already went over this in another video. My point was that I think most people's perception over, music beginning to suck at a certain point has to do with a bias towards the music that they're familiar with, a bias towards the music that they listened to when they were a teenager, versus music that's now they have a resistance, a rigidity to hearing that music with the same sort of emotional attachment. My idea was like I looked at the music theory of it and was like, well, it's all pretty simple, right? It's not theoretically so different even if there's lots of little, the backbeat may be different in this year. So I'm not going to go too deeper into that because I already did 2 videos on it. But basically, I believe that most people's perception of what is good music is affected by their bias and their expectations, which are kind of biased. The other one was, are feminists ruining the movies? And I did 2 videos on this, and I keep getting comments sort of responding to the title, and to the point where I'm like, I should just like take this video down. It's not really like a good video of mine. It's not like super articulate or clear, but it definitely informs me as to the nature of bias, because people come on that or the follow-up video I did, and they're like, yes, feminists are ruining the movies. I'm 100% certain that they're ruining the movies. Okay. So let's go look at a selection of movies. Let's look at all the movies that were released last year. And you look at them and you're like, none of them are feminist movies, right? There's like a couple movies where you're like, oh yeah, I think that had like a female lead in an action movie, and maybe we call that feminist. But even right away, people who are running that narrative through in their minds, they're searching for things in movies that are going to be feminist for them. And they'd probably read one of my books and be like, this is a feminist rag. Even though I've made like anti-feminist content in the past, or I've talked about feminist sophist devices. This is a feminist thing because there's a female main character. To the point where like you're going to see feminist themes in everything. You're searching for a pattern. And it's kind of like pareidoia. Pareidoia is something I'll talk about in just a second. Pareidoia is the ability to perceive patterns in noise. Like if you look at a grain of wood, you look at a piece of wood and you see a face in it. Or you see a face on like a grilled cheese sandwich. That's pareidoia. It's you assembling a pattern out of essentially noise. And that's in essence a type of bias. So anyway, those couple of videos are really informative to me as to why it's important to think about how this bias works, because even if I present a really good argument and really good evidence for that, somebody can change, especially when we're talking about aesthetic valuing, like movies and music. People can change the way that their bias is going to insist that they change their perception of it to match a previously established expectation, in which case I'm probably wasting my time. And that in turn, that lets me know if I see this, maybe I shouldn't waste my time trying to convince somebody of reality. So the next thing I'll talk about is, where does bias come from? And I mentioned pareidoia. And there's a really good video by Shane Killian that he did years ago, part of like the original Bogosity videos on pareidoia. And pareidoia is us like seeing faces in wood, or basically assembling patterns out of noise. Like, why do we have this is the question. And the reason is because there was most likely some selection in the past towards in early humans towards seeing patterns. And I think this example was actually in that video, so I'll link it below and you can watch the original. If you imagine an early human going to like the watering hole to get some water, and they're filling up their jar or their basket or whatever, and they look over at the grass and they see a tiger and they run away and they survive to reproduce, right? Which is what natural selection is all about. Great. So they have genes for seeing the tiger in the grass, and they go and continue to live. Now, what if they saw the tiger in the grass and there wasn't a tiger there? They assembled the image of a tiger out of like the waving grass. Well, they still reproduce and pass on the genes for seeing the tiger, whereas the person who didn't see the pattern at all gets eaten by the tiger and his genes go away. So there was some selection factor in the past that caused people to have the ability to see patterns and noise. And I think it's the same thing with bias. My conjecture, my hypothesis is really the same idea. Anytime we see this sort of stuff, it's like, well, why didn't we evolve to see reality perfectly? Well, reality is actually too complex for any person to perceive. I've talked about this in the past. Just as you're sitting here listening to me, you're probably unaware of an object sitting off to your left. And now you're going to be aware of it because I said it, and you're going to look and be like, oh, there's an object over there that I wasn't even thinking about and perceiving. It wasn't even in my mind. Or my cat was moving over there and I didn't see him, even though he was right in front of my face. Because we selectively filter everything. That's a kind of bias as well. And that's necessary because reality is really too complex for us to understand. So that's part of it. And that I think pretty much all animals that have a lot of senses like we do are going to have some amount of filtering that happens that changes perception. We also have biases with our memory. Like you have two people in the same room, they watch a crime happen, they have two different accounts of it because we make memories. We don't record memories, we create memories. And how we create memories has to do with what data we took in at the time, the way we filter it, and the way we contextualize it with stuff we've done in the past to make a new memory. Anyway, all this stuff's been studied by like neuroscientists and psychologists, and it's really, really interesting. Really interesting stuff. So the selection for it, I'll just tell another story. If you imagine that you are a chieftain, or we have a village chieftain with some early humans, and you live by a river, and this tribe of early humans lives by a river, and their primary source of protein is fish. So they pull fish out of the river every so often and share them and eat them. You have a tribesman come to the chieftain one day and says, 20 miles that way, 20 miles west towards the sunset, there's a bigger river with fish that are twice as big. And we can go eat fish that are twice as big if we move the camp over there. And the chieftain says, I don't believe you. I don't believe your big fish story. I've seen how big fish are. You didn't see any big fish. Now, is there any reason to just not believe the guy right away? I mean, without any other information, like the fact that he's lied in the past? Well, no. Why would he have a bias against these bigger fish? This could mean bigger fish. That could be better, right? Well, if you have a bias towards it, what is the decision science that maybe that bias is expressing that's just sort of ends up being, kind of concentrated through selection? Well, if the chieftain decides to go investigate these big fish, he's leaving the fish that he knows to go get maybe better fish, but he has to walk 20 miles. That's a whole day of walking. It's 2,000 calories worth of energy expended to go walk 20 miles over to this other river and see if the fish are bigger and walk 20 miles back. So from a simple risk reward thing, it's like I'm risking a lot. I'm expending a lot of resources to possibly get slightly more return. And then you just kind of say, well, that's not worth it. So life likes to be efficient. And if bias causes efficiency, it's probably going to increase its frequency. And this might be true of different kinds of social biases that exist that change our relationships with each other. Just as another example, and this really goes to my third point: is bias always wrong? Is bias always bad? Which is, if you have a boy who cries wolf, if you have somebody who lies all the time, and they come to you with something important to say, are you going to believe them? Well, the conventional wisdom would say you don't. No one believes a liar when he tells the truth. That indicates that we've developed a bias against what the information that person's presenting. We don't want to believe what that person's presenting because in the past it's been proven that person can't relay the truth to us. So if we have a bias against that person, that's an enhanced survival for us. Because if this person's like always lying to us, maybe one time he tells the truth, but at that point, there's so much resources involved with believing him every time that you need to just stop believing him. So you develop a quick bias against him so you don't spend any more resources believing the liar and go on with your life as if he doesn't exist. Because if you kept believing him every single time, you would lose all these calories, you'd lose all this time, you'd lose all this effort, which would lower your rates of survival. So no, bias is not always a bad thing. We had a selection for it in the past. Because it was advantageous to us in probably a million different ways that you can think of that are even better than mine. Is it advantageous today? It can be. I used to have a couple of sayings that I'd say. The first one is, if you believe in nothing, you'll believe anything. And the second one is, there's no virtue to an open mind. Because an open mind can cause you to believe something that is true and something that's false. And so the real virtue is being able to tell the difference between true and false, not just having an open mind and believing it. In fact, there's really no virtue to the open mind when you consider that by having an open mind to certain things, at the very least, you're wasting time. And time is of a limited quantity in this life. To a 16-year-old, 70 years seems like a long time, but once you start approaching middle age, it doesn't seem that old to you. and you want to be around for a long time, and your time is very, very precious, especially when you're short on time. Like looking at stuff, you really don't want to waste an hour entertaining an idea just because people think it's cool to have an open mind, when you know pretty well that idea is probably going to be a bunch of bunk. So biases can be good. And I say this thing, if you believe in nothing, you'll believe anything. I recommend everybody have a good concrete set of beliefs. I'm a libertarian. I believe in the non-aggression principle. That's a set of moral beliefs, a really simple one that it's really easy to quickly have a razor of something being moral or immoral. And that has been tested to me over and over again with different kinds of consequences as well. So right away, having a good guiding principle will help determine pretty quickly whether you want to really entertain an idea. So if somebody says, "Here, I'd like to talk to you about like why it's good to murder people," like here we go. Let me give you this argument for murdering these kind of people. Now, if you have this non-aggression principle, you're like, murder's wrong. I'm not going to waste my time listening to your argument. I'm not going to waste my time trying to argue with you. You were wrong because it's evil. It's bad. We're moving on. Okay, so that bias, you're actively biasing against that kind of information because you know already before you even need to listen to it that it's wrong. Now, I'm explaining it in this logical way, but having these firm sets of beliefs will let you like sort of quickly determine whether or not you need to even bother listening to something, which is a big time saver and will enhance your ability to be wealthy and happy as well. So another example is like anytime a politician opens his mouth, I know that I probably shouldn't believe what he says. Why is that? Well, it's because they lie all the time. And so I've developed this thing from the past that I don't believe any politician when they just say something. I just assume they're lying or misrepresenting what's there, or twisting what's there to sort of fit their narrative. And I know that the real narrative is probably lost in there somewhere. I know not to believe CNN because they lie constantly and misrepresent stuff constantly. I know not to believe the New York Times. And I've showed you on this channel the way that they actively bias their news. And it's like, I don't feel like I'm going to get good information from them. I'll get my information from somebody else that I feel is not going to be filtering out the information that I want to know. I end up with a bias against the New York Times. So anytime somebody says, here's a New York Times article, I'm like, I don't want to read it because I know it's probably garbage, right? I immediately, and this is a feeling inside me. It's not me logically going, oh, in the past. No, it's like, I don't want to read that, right? It's an immediate thing. So biases can actually really save you a lot of time if they're the right kind. Now the problem is that biases, because they do, cognitive biases do affect our perception of reality, it can stand in our way of understanding truth as well. So that's a double-edged sword. In one circumstance, it will save you time and energy. In another circumstance, it can prevent you or it can slow you down from understanding the truth. So certainly there's goods and bads to biases, and what I might like to do in the future, and you can let me know if this interests you, is talk about lots of different types of biases, like anchoring bias and the searching for patterns bias, and I'll learn about those because I don't know all the technical terms for these yet, because this is something kind of a new area of study that I've been involving myself in the last couple months, and I'd like to share. And so if I'll come up with the correct terms, and I'll talk about what I've observed and some of the things I may have read about it, and give you a little bit of information so that you're not falling victim to your own biases, but also so you can see the biases in others and arm yourself against them. So thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you'd like to support my work, you may do so by buying a book or buying some music. At some point, I may have a Patreon up, and you can throw me $1 if that is your idea of a value transaction and you want to give me some value with that. Otherwise, feel free to buy a book or movie. That's a great way to support me. So I do have a new book coming out. I finished it just a couple days ago, and you can actually read the original draft for free at dbspress.com/needleash, I think, or just go to dbspress.com. You can find it. It'll have all the spelling errors and all that wonderful stuff already intact. This is the pre-revision version. I'll have the revised version out probably in a week, and maybe a little bit over a week, depending on how quickly I get through it. So make sure you're on my mailing list if you'd like to read that, dbspress.com/list. and I will give you that free copy of that book even before release. And hopefully you'll like it. It is technically a sequel to Water of Awakening, the fantasy book I came out with last year. However, it is not necessary for you to read the first book if you just want to read the second. It's a different kind of story. It's a more localized story. It's less about an epic journey and more about politics and that kind of stuff. It's definitely a fantasy novel, though. So it's different main characters. That's why you don't have to read the first one. But if you don't have the first one yet, grab it. It's 99 cents on Amazon, or make sure you're on my list, and you'll probably get yourself a free copy of it at some point, just for being on my email list. Thank you so much, and I hope you guys will have a great day.